IB Nation, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. I appreciate y'all's patience. I had to get a couple last-minute graphics done there, so I'm getting off to a little bit of a late start, but I promise you it's going to be worth it. I got a good show planned for y'all today in today's Midweek Rundown. Just a quick reminder, we will not be doing a mailbag at the end of the show. I'll respond to any super chats that you guys send in there, but we're just going to kind of rock and roll on the content today. Number one, we're going to talk about Sam Hartman versus NC State. The really intriguing aspect of this matchup, in my opinion, or at least one of the many intriguing aspects of this matchup, is the fact that so many players at Notre Dame have never really played against NC State. Actually, I believe all but one has never played against NC State. Sam Hartman is quite familiar with NC State. They're obviously from the same division in the ACC, so he's faced against NC State 3 times. He's 1-2 against NC State. We're also going to talk about Brennan Armstrong and what Notre Dame needs to do to keep Brennan Armstrong in check, which then in turn slows down the NC State offense. And so we'll discuss that. And then, of course, we'll discuss a little bit of week 2 action. There's some interesting games this weekend, and we'll dive into those at the end of the show as well. So that is going to be the topics for today's podcast. Let's begin, however, with Notre Dame quarterback Sam Hartman going against NC State. And there's a few angles that intrigue me about this matchup. Number one is obviously just the Hartman versus NC State comparison, and I'll dive into that. But the other part of it that's going to sort of tie into this conversation is going to come down to what does Notre Dame mean, or say what does being at Notre Dame do for Sam Hartman, and is that going to really tell us a lot about just how good this team could be? Because even though NC State may not be, a great team on Notre Dame's schedule, and they're not. We talked about NC State yesterday, and I really like this football team at NC State. I had them in my preseason top 25. They stayed in my preseason top 25. I thought going on the road and earning a hard-fought victory at UConn was a solid season-opening victory for them. I feel when I look at this football team, I love their coordinators. I do. I've talked about this. You guys have heard us. At least you've heard me since I started this podcast and started Irish Breakdown. Notre Dame's gone against Robert and I. Like what's interesting is the first game that I covered when I launched Irish Breakdown was the Virginia game. That was the first game that we covered back in 2019. That was a Robert and I offense. You look at 2021 when they went against Virginia that season as well. That was a Robert and I offense. 2022 at Syracuse. So you all have heard me sing his praises plenty of times over the years. And, obviously I have a high regard for him. And as much as I dislike the 3-3-5 defense, I've also said there's one coach who I enjoy doing it. And it's a defensive coordinator in today's game. And that obviously is Tony Gibson, who I think does a really, really nice job. So we'll dive into those aspects of it. But the other part of it too is, as I said, and this is where we'll kind of start. Obviously, Sam Hartman's 1-2 against NC State, as I mentioned. They lost last year in 2022. They lost 30-21. It's Wake Forest won the matchup in 2021 by a 45-42 score, and then in 2020, NC State won by a 45-42 score. So in 2 of those matchups, we did see Wake Forest score a lot of points. Last year's game was interesting, to say the least. Wake Forest had a 14-10 lead in the second quarter. NC State scored late in the second quarter to take a 7-point lead. Then they scored the first 2 times of the second half. They scored a touchdown and a field goal in the third quarter. Wake Forest responded with a 29-yard touchdown, 99-yard drive in the fourth quarter. And it had ended with a 29-yard touchdown from Sam Hartman to A.T. Perry to make it 27-21. And then NC State went down the field and kicked field goal. And actually, it was a couple possessions later, they kicked a field goal. And a big part of last year's game was the fact that Sam Hartman turned the ball over 3 times. And you look at the year before, Sam Hartman put up a lot of numbers last season. The year before, not quite as good of numbers, but again, 3 turnovers. In that case, though, however, he counted for a lot more touchdowns, we'll get into. Wake had a big lead in that game a couple times, and then NC State battled back. Wake in 2021 had a 21-6 lead. NC State made it 21-20 with a couple touchdowns, and then NC State went up in the halftime 24-20. Wake did. NC State scored first in the second half. Then Sam Hartman led them on 2 touchdown drives, both ending with him throwing touchdowns. They took a 38-37 lead, 38-27 lead. NC State answered back. Wake went down and scored, made it a 10-point game, and then NC State scored a touchdown with 45 seconds left to make it a 3-point game. So it was a game that Wake controlled for the most part that season, before obviously NC State scored late. The game in 2020 was the most competitive of the three games. NC State actually took an early 21-7 lead. Wake came back, tied the game up 21-21. NC State went back up 14. Wake then scored the next two touchdowns to make it 35-35. NC State made it 38-45. Wake scored with 9 minutes left to go up 42-38, and then NC State scored with 5 minutes left to go up 45-42, and then that was the decisive score of that game. So it was a little bit more competitive. I felt kind of back and forth a little bit more, even though NC State a couple times pulled ahead with two touchdown scores. And so that part of the matchup is very interesting. And here's where I look at it from a big picture thing of why I think we're going to learn about Notre Dame with Sam Hartman. Because I've made this point before. Sam Hartman did some great things at Wake Forest, and his team's success was good relative to where he was. Going 11-3 2 years ago for Wake Forest is an exceptional season. And Notre Dame, that's a good season. It's what you expected Notre Dame. For Wake Forest, it's not something they do very often. And, even 8-5 last season and making it to a bowl game, winning a bowl game last season, those are just things that for a long time at Wake Forest were not assumed that were going to happen. And it speaks to the job Dave Clawson has done. And obviously Sam Hartman played a big role in that. But you look at it and say, well, that's Notre Dame didn't bring Sam Hartman here to go 8-5 or 11-3. They brought Sam Hartman here to compete for a championship. And you say, well, you're bringing a guy in that's never won at that level. They got smacked in the ACC title game 2 years ago. How does he help you win? Well, it comes down to it is the answer is, and this remains to be seen, is the team is better. I think we all believe the team is better, but they still have to show it on the field. And so the interesting thing is this is one of those games that more than any game on the schedule, there's two really, this game and then Clemson, actually, those two games more than any other games in the schedule give us a chance to truly evaluate I think where Notre Dame is relative to some of these other programs and how much being at Notre Dame can help Sam Hartman. And I think that not only matters to where Notre Dame is this season, but it also matters in future seasons when Notre Dame needs to go to the transfer portal for whoever, but especially a quarterback is, look, it's one thing to, put up numbers. And so far, Sam Hartman hasn't put up crazy numbers at Notre Dame. And obviously part of it's because he's really only played two halves of football. They came out in the third quarter of the game against Navy, and he threw a little bit, but most of the production came in the first half of that game. And then you look at last week, he was literally out of the game at halftime. So that's led into the numbers. I mean, he threw for 197 yards last week in a game, and you look at 197 yards in a game, that's not big time production. Did in 2 quarters. So we haven't really seen Notre Dame need him for 4 quarters, and that's kind of tamped the production down. But I've said before, I don't anticipate Sam Hartman throwing for the same amount of yards he threw 2 years ago at NC State when he threw for 4,200 yards. I hope last year's production is more of what we see when it was 3,700 yards and high 30s and touchdowns, which he is on pace for that from a production standpoint. But it's more so about looking at if you're a quarterback and you look at what Sam Hartman did at Wake Forest and the production he had. But then you look at the win-loss record. And then you look at Sam Hartman at Notre Dame and you say, well, the production was still good, you hope. But, man, look what they were able to do as a team. And that play is going to play a big role, in my opinion, in Notre Dame being able to kind of sell to people like, look, if they ever need a transfer portal quarterback again or any other portal player, it's going to give them a chance. And so I think there's a lot more at stake here for Notre Dame than just Sam Hartman in this season. It's also saying, hey, you can come to Notre Dame as a portal guy and have big time success, and we can really build you up. And this game against NC State is the first opportunity to give visible evidence of what being at Notre Dame does for you relative to what being at NC State does. And here's what I mean. If Sam Hartman goes out there and puts up numbers and has similar stat line to what he did at NC State, then it's like, okay, great. But what's the result? If the result is similar, close win, close loss to what he had at NC State, you're like, well, being at Notre Dame is really no different than being at Wake Forest at that point in time. I don't know how much that helps you. But if Sam Hartman's able to go out there and have a lot of success and control the game, and Notre Dame's able to dominate this game or win. When I mean dominate NC State, it's like a 14 to 17 point win where you're clearly the better team for 4 quarters. That speaks volumes, and I think helps Notre Dame show people they're like, hey, look, Sam Hartman elevates Notre Dame, right? And this is a point that Sean Davis has made to me in our conversations, and I believe he's made it on his show as well. But Notre Dame also elevates Sam Hartman, and that's the sort of the rub here. It's not just what can Sam Hartman do for Notre Dame, it's also what can Notre Dame do for Sam, or what can Sam Hartman. It's not just what Notre Dame can do for Sam Hartman, but it's also what Sam Hartman can do for Notre Dame. It's that kind of that two-way street that you look at. And it also gives us a chance to find out, is Sam Hartman a better quarterback at Notre Dame than he was at Wake Forest? By better, I do not necessarily mean production. That's not necessarily what I'm referring to here. By better, I'm also referring to how the offense as a whole is managed. And so the production can take a step back, but that doesn't mean that he's not a better quarterback. And we've already seen it to a certain degree in his 2 games at Notre Dame, where he has put up really good numbers in a lot of ways, even though the yardage numbers haven't necessarily been there as a whole. Partly because he hasn't played a ton, but we haven't seen him throwing a bunch of deep balls. We haven't seen him ripping teams up and things along those lines. But you look at his yards per attempt, he's at 11.6. His passer rating is over 225. He's completing over 80% of his passes. And you say to yourself, and I know I've said to myself, and I'm sure all of you have as well, but you're like, that can't continue, right? Like Sam Hartman's not going to go through the season and complete 82.5% of his passes, right? Like it's not feasible. It's just not last year, the best mark last year was 72.2, but year before that it was 73.9. Year before that it was 77.84 by Mac Jones, 76.3 by Joe Burrow, 73.1 in the year in 2018, 70.5 in 2017, 70.9 in 2016, 71.9 in 2015. You guys get the point, right? Like Sam Hartman's not going to go out there and complete 82.5% of his passes. But what is sort of the baseline? What does it look like for a quarterback at Notre Dame that's as good as he is, and as good as with what Notre Dame can do? How can that go together? And those are things that we're going to find out in this contest. And you look at, this contest is going to give us a sample of that. I talked before about, Notre Dame hasn't had a lot of big plays in the pass game, like big plays, but Sam Hartman's still averaging 11.1 yards per attempt. Again, last year, best mark was 9.5, 11.9 by Grayson McCall the year before. Best Power 5 mark was 10.1. Year before that, Mac Jones with 11.2, Joe Burrow was 11.3. So, that number, you say, well, maybe that's more sustainable. We'll find out, right? And these are the kind of teams that you find that out about. So you ask yourself, what's the baseline? What is okay when you're playing a good competition? What is the expectation? And I don't think NC State's necessarily a great team yet, but I think this defense is very good. I think they're coached very well. I had put an article out today where I talked about the importance of the offensive line. They got to play at a very high level because last 2 years, NC State's been one of the best run defenses in college football. They've been one of the best defenses in college football in regard to producing tackles for loss. They've been top 20 at both. They've been one of the best scoring defenses in college football. They've been one of the best passing defenses the last 2 years. This is a heck of a test. And obviously, they made Sam Hartman a very inefficient quarterback in their matchups. And so I think that's going to be a big part of this. But then there's the specific, okay, what is Sam Hartman able to do? And what is this Notre Dame offense able to do against NC State relative to what they've done in the past? That's the other part of it. I'm going to pull up this graphic here real quick and present this to you. So let's take a look at this right here. These are some interesting aspects of, as I said, what can Sam Hartman do for Notre Dame, but also what Notre Dame can do for Sam Hartman. And that's the next kind of part of what I want to dive into here. When you look at this is Sam Hartman against NC State the last 3 years, and that's what the top graphic is. And you see last year, 30-21 loss. Sam Hartman went 29 of 48 for 397 yards, a lot of yards. But the 2 touchdowns were negated by the 3 interceptions 8.3 yards per attempt is pretty good. It's definitely above average. 13.7 yards per catch is very good. 2021 in a 45-42 loss, he was very inefficient, and you saw NC State had 290 yards, 3 touchdowns, 3 picks, 6.2 yards per attempt, but 14.5 yards per catch. 2020 was probably his most steady game, as you see, 23 of 36. They had Kenny Walker that season, 63.9 completion rate, 236 yards, 1 touchdown, 0 pick, only 6.6 yards per attempt, only 10.2 yards per completion. So those numbers obviously don't knock your socks off, right? And they certainly don't mind. And you look at the result, right? So over a 3-year period, Sam Hartman has thrown 6 touchdown passes against NC State. That's an average of 2 per game. He also rushed for a touchdown in 2021. So he actually had 4 touchdowns that he accounted for against NC State in 2021. But you look at the overall production, obviously the yards, you had 1 year where the yards were high in a loss, another year where the yards were lower in a loss. And then, the middle season where they got a win, the yards were good, not elite, but good. He averaged 307.6 yards per game against NC State the last 3 years. But here's the part that I get into, and I'm gonna break down specifically what Notre Dame needs to do to ensure that Sam Hartman can eliminate some of the numbers here that were problematic, and we'll dive into that. But the first thing that you look at is when you compare the success Wake Forest had or the lack thereof. This right here, the bottom graphic right here, this part right here. Let's look at this down here, right? This shows exactly why Sam Hartman needed to come to a place like Notre Dame, because Sam Hartman's not Caleb Williams. This is no disrespect. He's not Caleb Williams. He's not the Trevor Lawrence. He's not that quarterback that can physically put a team on his shoulders. If Sam Hartman gets into a playoff game against a team like 2019 Ohio State and they're shutting down the Notre Dame receivers and they can't throw the football and they can't run the football, he's not going to go out there and rush for 100 yards the way that Trevor Lawrence did in 2019. That's just not who he is, and Notre Dame should never ask him to be that. But what he is a tremendous field general. But again, what's a great general needs the supporting cast. You've got to have the talent around you to then go lead your team to success. And at Wake Forest, he just simply did not have that in enough places. Receiver-wise, he did, and that led to a lot of the production. But from a run game standpoint, he didn't. And for those who can't see this when I publish the podcast later, or if you are watching you're doing the YouTube channel, but you're not listening, you're not watching, you're just listening. I'll read you the production. Last year, Wake Forest rushed for 17 yards on 25 carries. And 2021, Wake Forest rushed for 116 yards on 44 carries, 2.6 per attempt. And in 2020, they rushed for the best mark they had, 149 yards on 49 carries, just 3.0 yards per attempt. That's been a big problem. Here's problem number 2. And as we dive into problem number 2, I'm going to start focusing on what Notre Dame needs to do to be better. Actually, let's stick with the first one because we need to talk about that. First one, Notre Dame needs to be able to run the football on NC State. And this is much easier said than done. And we talked a little bit about this yesterday. We'll talk about this more tomorrow when we do Keys to Victory, because this is an important piece. NC State is a very good rushing defense. I mentioned this last night. They had 2 games where they gave up, actually 3 games last year where their production wasn't great last season from a run defense standpoint. You look at the Florida State game last season where they gave up 206 rushing yards, and you break that game down. Let me pull up the box score. Jordan Travis had over 100 yards rushing that game. I'm going to give you the specific number right now. Jordan Travis had 108 yards on 7 carries, including a 71-yard run. The rest of the running backs accounted for 98 yards in that game on 21 carries and 1 touchdown for NC State last season. For Florida State last season. So the production came from Jordan Travis. You look at the other game that they gave up yards was against Syracuse, and NC State lost 24-9 to Syracuse. And you look at Syracuse's production in that game from a rushing standpoint. Syracuse rushed for 179 yards in that game. Sean Tucker had 98 on 14 carries, thanks to a 38-yard gain, which is good production. But then Garrett Schrader had 81 yards on 16 carries. It's their quarterback. So a lot of their production as well came from their quarterback. And then Louisville is the one team that was able to run on NC State last year. They had 192 yards against NC State last year. And theirs did come from running backs, mostly running backs anyway. Brock Dorman, their starting quarterback, had 26 yards rushing, but Jawar Jordan had 105 yards, and then Maurice Turner had 59 yards. So their two running backs combined for 164 yards on 31 carries, which helped them win that football game. But most of the production last season, when they had it, came with the quarterback run. Well, that's, again, not who Sam Hartman is. You look at what NC State did against Wake Forest last season when it comes to their rushing defense. As we talked before, they give up 17 yards on 25 carries. It's going to be very hard for Notre Dame to win this football game if they don't run the football. It's going to be very hard. It's hard for Sam Hartman to execute the offense with the efficiency and explosive that's needed if Notre Dame can't run the football. And NC State's going to do everything they can to stop the run. Look, Tennessee State did that. Navy did that. They're going to watch the Tennessee State game. They're going to see a lot of the mistakes that Notre Dame made, handling some of the pressures, especially the pressures that came from depth. So Tennessee State did a lot of outside pressures. They did a lot of third-level pressures where they would insert extra guys into the box from outside the box to stop the run. That's very much in line with what NC State does and what NC State believes in. So they're going to shut down the run, and they're going to say, we beat Sam Hartman last year with A.T. Perry, with Jamal Banks, with Donovan Green, with Taylor Marin. We beat him with those receivers. Guess what? They don't have that at Notre Dame. That's the perception. And if I was another team, I would understand. I would feel that way. And we'll dive into, we'll have to dive into kind of some of the different things that they do. And we'll discuss a little bit more tomorrow. But the fact of the matter is you've got to be able to establish the run. Now, does Notre Dame go out there and run for 250 yards win this game? No, they don't. It's more about give your offense a good, steady dose, be able to have a nice, steady dose of success on first and second down, to get yourself in more third manageable situations, to get yourself in where you're even avoiding first downs to begin with, where if you feel like throwing the football on first down, you're not deathly afraid of doing that because you can't run the ball on second down. So if you throw an incomplete pass on first down, you're not going to be able to run on second down. So you're almost dooming yourself to a third and long if you don't complete the pass on first down. That's going to impact the play caller's mindset going as he goes through a game if you're struggling to run the football on first down. So being able to run the football is going to be key. And that's why I wrote the article I wrote this morning and published at irishbreakdown.com about how the offensive line thriving is really the key to the game. If Sam Hartman has a big game, that's on him, right? But it doesn't happen without the offensive line and the run game doing their part. And that's something he's never had against NC State. And he's going to need that. He's going to need that. The whole point of Sam Hartman coming to Notre Dame was to be surrounded by a better talent, right? I mean, that's the whole point. Better defense, better line, better run game. Well, what's the point of coming to Notre Dame if when you get into these situations, you don't run the ball any better than the Wake Forest offenses did? It's imperative that they come out and win that football game or run the football, which is going to help them win this football game. That's obviously a big part of it. Here's another statistic that led to Sam Hartman's lack of success against NC State in recent seasons, and that is pressure. Now, NC State has not been like a huge sack team in recent years. Like last season, I mentioned, I think, what did I say yesterday? They ranked, what was it, like 16th or 17th in tackles for loss. Let me pull up these numbers. NC State last year was 16th in tackles for loss last season. And then you look at, actually, I think I have these numbers here in front of me. Yes, I do. Got my sheet from my notes from my article for this morning. They were 17th last year in tackles for loss. They were 17th in 2020 in tackles for loss. And that's tackles for loss per game. And I prefer that number over total tackles for loss because teams don't always play the same number of games. And that was especially true in 2020. So that number's tackles for loss. And obviously they've had a lot of success doing that against Wake Forest in recent years. And so last year in the game against Wake Forest, NC State had 9 tackles for loss. And they had, so I got it written down here. They had, where did I put my sack numbers? They had 4 sacks, 9 tackles for loss. So 4 sacks in the pass game, 5 tackles for loss in the run game. You look at 2021 and you look at the production there. You look at tackles for loss in 2021. Wake Forest against NC State had, it's down here, 5 tackles for loss and 3 sacks. A little bit better, but that's still negative production. And then in 2020, it was really not good. They had 12 tackles for loss against NC State and 6 sacks against NC State in a 45-42 win. So, and then when you look at just the overall pressures and the way that they've been able to pressure the quarterback in recent seasons, they've been able to have a lot of success getting after the quarterback, even when they weren't getting sacks. According to Pro Football Focus last year, NC State had 30 pressures against Wake Forest, 30 total pressures, and 6 of those pressures were resulted in hits on the quarterback, either sacks or hits on the quarterback. So 6 times in that matchup that season. And then you look at 2021. Again, these numbers are according to Pro Football Focus. Against Wake Forest, they had 20 pressures, but 7 hits on the quarterback. Obviously, sacks or hits on the quarterback. So a lot of pressures in that game. They batted 4 passes. They batted down 4 passes last season, or in 2021 as well, in that matchup. And then you go to the 2020 game, which was their first game of the season that year, and NC State had 27 pressures on Sam Hartman and had 12 hits on the quarterback, either sacks or hits on the quarterback. So they've been able to get consistent pressure on Sam Hartman, and it's not just the sacks. It's the hits, it's the pressures, it's the being in his face. And you're talking about 50% or more on dropbacks. They're getting a pressure on the quarterback in some of these games. That's just something that Notre Dame's offensive line, again, cannot allow to happen. When you're a quarterback and you come to Notre Dame, the whole point is to say, I'm going to play behind a great offensive line, or that's one of the big points. I'm going to play behind a great offensive line. And this is the kind of game where that offensive line has to make their money, so to speak, and has to prove that, yeah, if you're a quarterback, you want to be behind this line, because in games like this, they're going to protect you and they're going to establish the run, which also, to a degree, protects you. But when I say protect you, I mean directly protects you. Coach Freeman said that he liked the pass pro against Tennessee State. I don't agree with that. I didn't agree with that takeaway. I didn't like the pass pro, especially early. There was a couple times they forced Sam Hartman to scramble. We broke this down in the upon further review. There was a couple really big missed opportunities. Wake Forest or NC State's going to bring pressure from all over. They're going to blitz corners. They're going to blitz safeties. They're going to blitz linebackers. They're going to run twists. They're going to run stunts. They do a lot of overload pressures. So overload pressures from a side, they'll only bring 5, which if you just go by the very raw definition of a blitz, which I don't necessarily, it needs to be more than that. Hey, you bring 5 or you bring 6. And to me, a pressure is either you bring more numbers than I have blockers total, which is an obvious one. But then the other way to blitz where you're not bringing 6, 7, 8 guys is an overload pressure from the side. NC State does a lot of that. They bring a lot of weak side pressure, and they'll bring some strong side pressure, but a lot of weak side pressure where, you have basically your guard, your tackle, and a back, and then they'll bring kind of 4. So they'll slant someone to that side, bring another guy crashing through, and then bring 2 off the edge. They'll slant a guy in, bring another guy off the edge. So they'll try to bring an inside pressure to take on the back, right? So you bring like an A-gap pressure where the back's got to step up from the second level, and then you bring like a slant in front of the tackle's face and then a guy off the edge. Now you may have enough numbers that account for it, but they do it so aggressively and so fast that a lot of times the tackle and guard don't get out to those games fast enough. So the tackle steps down, the guard's not quick enough to get in front of the guy slanting. Or the guard can get over to help and get the guy slanting, but the tackle doesn't get off that double team fast enough to get the guy that's slanting outside of the guy that's firing off outside, and you get pressure on the quarterback. They do a lot of that stuff. Sam Hartman has to help himself by making sure the protections are set effectively, and then getting the ball out when he knows they can't block a guy. So, based on the pre-snap look, you can say, okay, if they bring 4 here, we can't block that guy. I got to know that. And if he does come, I've got to get rid of the football here. And then, of course, set the protections. But the offensive line has to finish blocks. They have to do a better job of sustaining blocks in the pass game, finishing blocks in the pass game, and giving Sam Hartman time to throw the football. That is a huge key to this game. And to me, establishing the run is important, but they've got to protect the quarterback. If you watch last year's game and the last 2 years' games, when most of Sam Hartman's mistakes were because he was getting pressured. and he would try to make a play, and it hurt him. The first pick he threw last year was, and this is where the run game comes into play, was a play where he thought he had a guy crossing and somebody dropped into coverage and just he didn't see it and picked it off because they were disguised the coverage very well. If Notre Dame's not able to run the football effectively and the box is able to kind of create those negatives, and then they can't push the defensive line off the ball, and the linebackers are getting through and all those type of things, then what's going to happen is that's going to allow them to do a lot more disguising pressure. So they're going to put guys in the box and they're going to drop guys. They're going to disguise pressures. They're going to show, eight in the box, so 3-3, and then bring a safety down and maybe have a another guy over there. I could see NC State trying to out of their 3-5 being able to do some things that maybe they get extra body, bigger body in the field. I'm very curious how they're going to handle that against Notre Dame, with Notre Dame being able to run the ball. Do they try to change and adapt their personnel at all? Maybe get a fourth backer on the field. Those are going to be interesting things Notre Dame has to be prepared for. But if they stay true to their 3-3-5, then they're going to do a lot of things to try to create havoc in the run game, and they have to handle that. But they also have to be able to keep NC State in the box. And so what happens is if Notre Dame's able to effectively run the football, then that forces NC State to keep those guys down and continue to attack the run, which then should open up opportunities in the play action game that he didn't really have. Wake Forest liked to run a lot of play action, but the reason a lot of that stuff never worked against NC State is because they could never run the football. So they would be doing that slow mesh, and NC State's like, we don't care. Our 5 are whooping your 5. So we still have 6 guys in coverage. And that created a lot of tip balls with Sam Hartman. In NC State, it created a lot of him having to throw into the tight windows when he did complete passes. I mean, some of the completions he had last year, like, good Lord, like that's a heck of a throw right there. And same thing with the 2021 game. And what it did, however, is it allowed NC State to force turnovers. One of his picks was like a bad, guy that kind of hit off one of his guys, and there was some of that stuff. But it was a tight window throw. If Notre Dame's able to run the football, it keeps NC State more condensed. It opens up more of those downfield opportunities, the outside one-on-ones, the over-the-middle stuff, the play actions, the back out of the backfield, and allowing the backs to get leverage outside. But it all has to come down to establishing the running game and protecting the quarterback. If you do that, then Sam Hartman's going to thrive against NC State. I wholeheartedly believe that, because when he did have a clean pocket against NC State in those games, he was successful. He was good in those games, and so it's going to be a big key. I'm actually going to pull this up real quick because I am curious about what the specific numbers were against them and against NC State. So yeah, here you go. So against NC State in 2021, actually, let's start with 2022. Let's go to that game in 2022. Let's see. Sometimes this whole website can be a little frustrating to navigate through. So let's go to last season. And Sam Hartman last season, when he was under pressure, threw 2 picks. 2 of his picks were when he was under pressure. He did have a pick from a clean pocket, but he completed over 61% of his passes last season in a clean pocket. And when you look at, just the ability to protect the quarterback, again, that's a big part of it. They were able to get the ball down the field last year against NC State, but a lot of his success came in the short game from a completion percentage, but they didn't get a lot of yards because NC State was able to drop guys into coverage. If you're able to run the football, it's going to open up more opportunities. When you look at 2021, when Sam Hartman was pressured in 2021, as I mentioned, he threw 2 interceptions under pressure in 2021. So 2 of his 3 interceptions were while facing pressure. And just look at his overall numbers. Where did it go? Here we go. I keep looking for Wake Forest, but it's actually NC State. So under pressure in 2021 is even worse. He went 2 of 11 and threw 0 touchdowns and 2 picks. When he had a clean pocket in 2021, he threw for 268 yards, 3 touchdowns, and a pick. So obviously there's much, much better production that season than he had the year before. And then let's go to 2020 and look at that number. And Wake Forest in that game, Sam Hartman, under pressure, he went 7 of 12 for 64 yards under pressure. So no big plays, no yak, 5.3 yards per attempt. That just obviously that stuff wasn't there. So key is when he's kept clean, he's much better. The numbers are much better. That's not rocket science. That's true to a lot of places. But I think it's going to be especially true in this game because even in those games where he was kept clean, if you break the games down, NC State a lot of times was dropping 7 or 8 guys into coverage because they had no respect for the Wake Forest run game and because their defensive line was kicking the Wake Forest offensive line's behinds. That's going to be a big part of this game. So when you look at the breakdown, Sam Hartman against Notre Dame, or Sam Hartman with Notre Dame against NC State, if it's going to be about what does the supporting cast do? Does the supporting cast step up and give him the aid that he didn't have at Wake Forest? Running the football, protecting the quarterback, being disciplined, being smart, not allowing run-throughs, limiting tackles for loss, limiting hits on the quarterback, all those type of things. And then can the receivers provide the help that he did have at Wake Forest, which is when he does get time, when he does get a clean pocket, if the running game is going and he's getting the ball out there, are they coming off the line with urgency? Are they snapping off their routes? Are they making contested catches? Are they getting free? That's going to be the other part of it. And that's another unknown about this Notre Dame football team. They've been able to just kind of out-talent some not very good teams in the last first 2 weeks. From a pass game standpoint, this is going to be a much, much tougher test for Notre Dame. And so if Sam Hartman wants to get into his career against NC State with a W, he's going to have to obviously play clean football. That's going to be his task. Don't try to play hero ball against NC State. Trust your defense enough, because this is the third piece. The look at what his team gave up the last 3 years. 30 points last year against a bad offense, a bad NC State offense. 42 the year before, 45 the year before. So in 3 games against NC State, Wake Forest and with Sam Hartman, the quarterback, averaged 39 points a game. If you're Sam Hartman, you have to understand that could arguably be the biggest difference between what he had at Wake Forest and what he has at Notre Dame. It's a much better defense. You don't have to play hero ball. You don't have to force balls into triple coverage. It's okay to just throw it away. It's okay to just scramble and take what you can get. It's okay sometimes to even take a sack. Don't turn the football over, but then also don't be unwilling to take some chances when they're there. Just be smart about it and take some of those chances when it's a one-on-one and those type of things. And so that's something that I look forward to and say, hey, listen, if they're able to protect the quarterback and run the football and Sam Hartman plays smart, then Notre Dame is going to be okay. And that's going to be the end of the bargain Sam Hartman has to hold up if the offensive line and run game is able to do what they need to do. It's play cleaner football without getting into the other problem that Notre Dame quarterbacks have had, which is they're unwilling to take any chances. And that's where that middle ground needs to be found. And if all those things click, this is going to be a really, really big win for Notre Dame because I do like the matchup of the Notre Dame defense against NC State offense, which we're going to talk about here in a minute when we get into how you defend Brennan Armstrong. So before we do that, I'm going to take a quick 30-second intermission. So I'm going to play the Irish Breakdown music. I'm going to have the countdown going on, and then I'm going to come back and we're going to get rocking and rolling on what Notre Dame needs to do to defend Brennan Armstrong. All right, part 2 of today's midweek rundown is going to focus on the Notre Dame defense and the task they have in regard to slowing down Brennan Armstrong. And when you look at this NC State football team, one of the tasks that Robert and I and Dave Dorn and the rest of the offensive staff, Dave Dorn is the head football coach at NC State, Robert and I is the offensive coordinator at NC State. But one of the tasks that they have in this matchup is they're going to have to slow down Brennan Armstrong. That's what Notre Dame has to do. But one of the tasks, the big picture task, and the reason that stopping Brennan Armstrong is so important is because the rest of the offense at NC State's just not as good as it's been in the past. And that's going to be the task for Robert and I and Dave Dorn and the rest of the staff in future seasons, is recruiting better talent at the skill positions. And NC State has quality skill. Don't get me wrong. These aren't a bunch of stiffs out there running around. But remember, this is a school that produced Torrey Holt, right? Like, this is a school that's produced recent season Nyheim Hines, who was a really explosive running back. This is a school that has produced some really quality skill players over the years, and they just don't have that right now. If we're being honest, they just don't have that kind of impact pass catcher that they've had. They had a Mecca Measy a couple years ago in 2021. He's a really good football player. This is a school that had Kelvin Hartman a few years ago and Jacoby Myers in 2018. They were a really dynamic 1-2 punch at wide receiver. They had Jalen Samuels a few years ago, who's a really explosive athlete, not necessarily a great football player, but at least an explosive athlete. And they just don't have that kind of guy, in my opinion, on this football team at NC State. So they've got quality guys. They just don't have that really, really impact guy. And so you look at the running game, especially, it's not, there's not a lot of, in my opinion, talent there either. It's quality players. I don't want to act like these guys are stiffs, but it's quality players, but nothing that should scare you just from the talent of that player, right? It's just, quality backs that if the offensive line does their job, they're going to be pretty good, right? They're going to be pretty productive. But there's no guy that you look and say, boy, if we don't do this, this guy's going to destroy us because he's such a great player. It isn't that. Really what it comes down to, the guy that really can scare you, that can put some I don't say fear, because you're Notre Dame, you shouldn't fear anyone, but the guy that can give you the most matchup problems when it comes down to it is quarterback Brennan Armstrong. And the key for Notre Dame is going to be, how do you defend Brennan Armstrong? And there's really a couple ways to do it. And I'm going to kind of dive into some of my thoughts on how to defend Brennan Armstrong. And I'm going to address one thing that a lot of people talk about that I personally don't like, and that is using a spy. And I'm going to talk about the LSU Florida State game. And this is not a Brian Kelly rant. It's let's talk about what you watched that game. Did you guys see the production that Harold Perkins had in that game? Right? Harold Perkins is one of the most dynamic athletes in all of college football. Last season, as a true freshman, Harold Perkins had 73 tackles, 14 tackles for loss, and 8.5 sacks. He had another 14 hurries. And last season also, or this season against Florida State, Harold Perkins had 5 tackles, no tackles for loss, no sacks, no hurries. He was essentially taken out of the game by the LSU coaching staff. They used him as a spy for Jordan Armstrong. So what happened? Did Jordan Armstrong go off running the football in that game? No, he didn't. He didn't really go off in that game. He had 38 yards on 7 carries. It's a decent day. But guess what happened? They lost their best pass rusher. And so in the second half, and Florida State was able to find some pass game matchups that allowed them to just rip LSU apart. And Jordan Armstrong in that game went Jordan Travis in that game went 23 of 31 for 74.2% completion rate. He threw for 342 yards and 4 touchdowns in that game. That's exceptional production for him. I'm looking in the past. I think the bowl game from Oklahoma last year, Georgia Tech, those are the only times he's thrown for that many yards. If I'm looking at it correctly here, that's his 3rd highest ever yards in a game, and that's against supposedly a really good LSU defense. And his 4 touchdown passes was a career high for Jordan Travis in that game. And a big part of that was you took one of your best athletes, your most explosive athlete, and you took him out of the game to spy the quarterback. And to me, I'm not a big fan of that. I'm really not. I don't think that works as an overall strategy. Now, are there situations where I would say, in this particular situation, would I have a middle of the field spy? Yes, I would. Those are in 3rd and longs. If you're in a 3rd and 9+, I would have a middle linebacker that kind of drops at like 10, 11, 12 yards and just kind of stays there to help protect against some of the in stuff, but he's also keying on the quarterback. So I would do things to kind of, protect your outside with your front, but then have one of your linebackers who's going to be athletic, whether it's Jalen Sneed or Maris Luafau or JD Bertrand or Jack Kaiser. They all run well enough. Jaden Alsbury, Drake Bowen, they all run well enough to catch Brennan Armstrong. Those are situations, say, sure, have a spy there. I do not believe in having a spy defending the quarterback on first and second down, third and medium, and those type of things, because what you're going to do is you're going to then open up other throwing lane matchups. You're going to then eliminate your ability to pressure the quarterback in those games. And to me, that's something that it could really prove detrimental in this game for Notre Dame if they're able to allow Brennan Armstrong to get comfortable in the pocket, because one of my keys to success is actually keeping Brennan Armstrong in the pocket. But if you're keeping him in the pocket, but you're just taking away one of your defenders to just spy on him, then you've eliminated some of the advantages that you have by keeping Brennan Armstrong in the pocket. Now, I'm not someone who believes Brennan Armstrong is a bad quarterback from the pocket. I've just always felt, having broken him down over the years, that he's just more dynamic when he's moving around. And when you have to fear or respect his ability to scramble around and throw the football over your head. He's been very, very effective in those situations during his career. He's a guy, to me, that is I'll kind of show you some numbers. Actually, let me find the 2021 season when he was at his best. That 2021 season, that's the year that Brennan Armstrong threw for over 4,000 yards, had 31 touchdowns. But when you look at Brennan Armstrong that season, when he had a clean pocket, he threw for 3,800 yards and 28 touchdowns, and that's great, right? That's very, very, very good. But he also threw 10 picks, according to Pro Football Focus. He had 29 batted balls. He had 15 turnover-worthy throws, right? And those are, in my opinion, pretty high numbers if you really break it down and look at the production that he had that season. He also had some very dynamic pass catchers that, sitting in the pocket, could allow him to be effective. Now, when he was pressured, he dropped all the way down to 45.1% completion rate and he only averaged 6.6 yards per attempt. Only threw 3 touchdowns that season when he was pressured. And so when you look at, to me, and you break the film down, you see a guy that does a lot of different things when he's moving around and able to buy time in the pocket. And when he's starting to scramble around, he starts running, he starts moving the chains, and that gets you to have to bite up, and then all of a sudden he's throwing it over your head. So to me, the big key for me is, again, in this particular matchup, this wouldn't have worked as well in 2021 because he had way better weapons. But in this particular matchup, Notre Dame holds the skill advantage on the outside. At least they should, right? And so to me, it's one of those games where if you start heating him up on early downs, if you have a heavy blitz package against NC State, my fear is that, now it could work, and if the blitzes are hitting home and they're getting to the running backs and getting to the quarterback, that's great. That's great. But here's the danger. If they don't hit home, Brennan Armstrong can rip you up with his legs and his arm. And that's the concern for me, is if you're going to be a heavy first and second down blitz team and you don't get to the quarterback, you're going to have a hard time containing Brennan Armstrong, because there's going to be the pressure line, which is your D-line and linebackers that are coming, and then it's everybody else that's bailed, and there's that big open zone in between. And that's just the nature of the pressures that you're going to bring. And if he gets through that first level, then he's going to rip you up. And that's what we saw in past years, to a degree last season, but even more so in previous seasons under Clark Lee, is when the quarterback would kind of get get to that first line, they had a hard time getting to him. And Brennan Armstrong's the kind of guy that in space can give you some problems. So to me, step one for Notre Dame is containing Brennan Armstrong and just keeping him in the pocket and forcing his wide receivers to beat your defensive backs. That's going to be the second part, is if you keep him in the pocket and he can't move the chains and extend drives with his legs, it now comes down to, are their receivers better than your DBs? And the reality is they're not. So as long as Notre Dame's defensive backs play to their potential, they should be able to keep the receivers and tight ends in check. Now, if there are missed assignments and those type of things, sure, that becomes a problem. But if Notre Dame plays clean on the back end and Brennan Armstrong's kept in the pocket and he can't run around and scramble, It's going to make them less effective and less efficient in the pass game. And it's going to make them it's going to be make it harder for NC State to move the chains. And so to me, I'm actually someone who believes in having a game plan where your goal is to pressure the quarterback with your front. I'm a big believer in that. And I believe that Notre Dame this year has the athleticism up front to do that. They also have the size up front to be able to do that with Riley Mills up the middle, Jason Onye, those kind of guys, and then athletically with Howard Cross to be able to get into the backfield to where if the pressure can come up the middle, then you force Brennan Armstrong out. As long as your defensive ends can do a better job of contain than they did last week, then he's going to have some problems. So step one to me is allowing your defensive line to be your first line of defense, pun intended, when it comes to the pass game. And that allows you to use your linebackers to drop underneath quick routes, which takes away the quick game. Robert and I likes to throw a lot of quick game. You get a chance to take a lot of that away if you're able to get after the quarterback with your front four. And that's going to be a big part of being able to have success in, against this NC State offense. When you look at, for example, Brennan Armstrong's production in 2021, he completed 37 deep balls. Those are passes 10 yards or 20 yards or more. If you look at other aspects of it, the intermediate pass game that season, he was 11 to 9. Actually, for Pro Football Focus, it's 10 to 19. He completed 94 passes for 1,600 yards, 7 touchdowns, 4 picks. In the quick game, Brennan Armstrong was very productive. He completed 142 passes, 1,300 yards, 8 touchdowns, and he had another 310 yards and 4 touchdowns on stuff behind line of scrimmage. So Robert and I likes to attack the intermediate stuff. I mean, he's going to get the ball down the field. Don't confuse that. And they like to have big plays, but they were able to be successful throwing the ball down the field in 2021 because they had Dontavian Wicks. They had Jelani. Why do I keep forgetting that kid's name from Virginia? I did this yesterday as well. Give me a second. I'm going to find that kid's name. He's big, tall. Jelani Woods, right? Isn't that his name? Let's see here. Yeah, Jelani Woods. You had Katawan Thompson. You had Billy Kemp, Rashawn Henry. They had 5 receivers that year who had over 500 yards. NC State doesn't have that kind of talent at wide receiver, in my opinion. So I don't think that they can gash you as much with that part of their game. So to me, keeping him in the pocket, letting the D-line be that first line of defense. Then when you do trigger linebackers, what I thought worked against North Carolina last year, which I thought was very effective, is a lot of their pressures would kind of come up the middle. And even when they would show outside pressure with Maris, but then he would twist inside. And so then Drake May would step into the pocket, and then there's a linebacker coming up the middle to kind of bring that pressure. And they didn't have the same lack of inside contain issues that they had in the past. And of course, part of that contain is just your D tackles can't run past the quarterback, right? And your defensive ends have to be able to get off blocks better than they did this past week. But adding that extra interior guy, I think, helps keep some of that. And then you get in Brennan Armstrong's face a little bit because, like Sam Hartman in past years, Brennan Armstrong will force balls into traffic. If you get him on his heels, he'll force balls into traffic. And so that's what I want to see Notre Dame be able to do when it comes to getting after him. And then when you do bring a pressure, it's got to hit. You've got to feel good about its ability to hit. You don't want to have – here's the thing. You can say, well, our goal is to get enough pressures by consistently blitzing the quarterback. Sometimes it'll hit home. Sometimes it won't. But we'll create enough disruptions to create stops. Okay, that's okay in some weeks. But when you're playing a quarterback that's this dynamic with his legs, it can also create problems. So if you're going to pressure, you better have pressures that are designed to hit that will have a very high success rate. Because if they don't hit, if your linebackers get blocked, if your linebackers miss, then he is going to step up and hurt you running the football. And we saw that against UConn. I thought in a lot of ways, UConn did a great job defending Brennan Armstrong. I do. I thought in a lot of ways they did things that allowed him to effectively run around and move the football and have success against UConn. And you look at his numbers from the game. He went 17 of 26 for 155 yards, no touchdowns, no interceptions, 6.0 yards per carry. If he has numbers like that against Notre Dame, you have to feel good about Notre Dame's ability to win this football game as long as they don't allow this number. He had 19 carries for 96 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's it right there. Right? Is you can't allow that. Keep him in the pocket. When you look at his passing production against UConn, he went 0 of 3 on balls 20 yards or more. He went 3 of 6 for only 42 yards on passes of 10 to 19 yards. So on throws beyond 10 yards, he only had 42 yards, and he went 3 of 9 on those throws. Right? That's where Notre Dame needs to be. You know, he went 7 for 7 on passes behind the line of scrimmage for 63 yards. He went 7 of 10 for 36, 50 yards on throws under 10 yards. So there just wasn't a lot of that pass game production against UConn, but they were able to move the ball enough because he could run, because he had 96 yards on 19 carries. And then that opened up other opportunities in the throwing game. So look, if he's going to run the football and get some yards on design quarterback runs, okay, as long as you're not letting him gash you in big runs, but that's true of any running back or any run call. That's okay, because that allows me as a defensive coach to say, okay, fine, you guys want to run quarterback power, you guys run a quarterback counter, you guys want to run read zone. As long as our defense, looking at it from the defensive coordinator standpoint, is disciplined, we're going to shut that down. We're going to handle that, but it also allows us to get hits on the quarterback, more hits on the quarterback. What you can allow is you can allow him to go make plays running the football in the pass game, where it's 3rd and 7, you're about to get off the field, and you let him run for 9 yards or more. You can't allow him to flip the field with a long run because you lost contain, because you brought a pressure that didn't hit home and he took off, and your safeties all have their backs turned because they're playing deep coverage and all that other kind of stuff, and he's gashing you like that. If you eliminate those, then this offense doesn't have the weapons around him to be as effective. Because when I look at Robert and I's offense last year at Syracuse and the production they had, they don't have an Aronde Gadsden at NC State. When I look at what they had at Virginia in 2021, NC State doesn't have a Tontavian Wicks. That kid had 57 catches for 1,200 yards that year. They don't have a K'Tawan Thompson who had 77 catches for 973 yards that year. They don't have even a Rayshon Henry who had 603 yards on 34 carries. They don't have a Jelani Woods, who's their number 2 kind of tight end, although the position for K'Tawan Thompson, they literally had him listed as an FBP, which stood for football player. He didn't have a position. His position was football player, whatever. But he basically played like a hybrid tight end, essentially, is how they used him for a chunks of the game. And then Jelani Woods was more of a traditional tight end. He caught 44 passes for 98 yards. There's literally not a single guy at NC State, in my opinion, that's as good as any of those guys, in my view. Now, they're solid. And if you're not disciplined and you're not doing what you need to do, then they can hurt you. But they're not guys that talent-wise should just take over a game the way that happened. Or even if you look at Virginia in 2019, when they played against Notre Dame, you know, they had Hassis Dubois, who I thought was an excellent player. He's a big kid, if you guys remember that game. And he just, if you guys remember correctly, he had like 2 or 3 catches where he just went over Tariq Bracy and just outsized him for the football. You know, he was a kid that was, 6'3", 215, Jersey kid. So Ryan probably loved that, right? I know Ryan's in the chat. They had Joe Reed, who was a really good kick returner. He was a bigger kid. You know, he was able to go out there. Both of those kids had over 100 yards against Notre Dame in 2000 and when they faced against Virginia in 2019. Again, they don't have that kind of guy. They don't have a Terrell Jana like they had that season at NC State this year, in my opinion. So I believe that if you keep him in the pocket and make this a wide receiver game, shut down the run game, keep Brennan Armstrong in the pocket and make this a receiver versus DB game, that bodes very well for Notre Dame. When Brennan Armstrong's getting in space, that is problematic for Notre Dame. And that's how a game where you should really keep NC State in check turns into a game where this is a shootout because your offense needs to score against a really good defense. So to me, that's going to be the key. If you take Brennan Armstrong, if you keep him from impacting the game dynamically with his legs this early in the season, I believe NC State's going to have a tougher time to score. So that's the key for me. Be disciplined with your pass rush lanes. Allow the defensive line to take this game over. Take away the quick game, which that's an easy thing. Notre Dame already kind of is designed to do that, the way that they play coverage-wise. And then the final piece to me is if you're able to get good, decent pressure on him, do contain, take his legs away. The second part of that to me is Brennan Armstrong has never struck me as a guy that is a super quick processor of reads. Not that he's slow or not smart. He's just not super quick. And I believe he's got a bit of a long delivery. So the final piece to me is really do a good job of mixing up your coverage looks. I don't care that Notre Dame runs a lot of coverages. I'm not a have 9 coverages kind of guy. What I like is having 3, 4, 5 coverages at the most you're going to use in a game, but then getting to them a lot of different ways. So if we're going to line up this particular way, we can get to 3, 4 different coverages out of this alignment. And if we're going to line up this way, we can get all of our looks out of these different things. And you don't quite know what they're going to do. If Notre Dame can do that and have just some success with their pass rush and keeping Brennan Armstrong in the pocket, if he's making throws from further back with that long delivery and just a hair late compared to some other quarterbacks, to me, that's going to result in a defense like Notre Dame, if they're disciplined, being able to get their hands on more footballs than we saw last season. And that should allow them to force incompletions, but more so potentially force some turnovers and really get into NC State into some difficult second and long, third and long type of situations. And that's when you can spy. That's when you can have a guy spying on Brennan Armstrong, as if it's 3rd and 9, 3rd and 10, 3rd and 11, all those type of aspects. So those are, to me, the keys to slowing down Brennan Armstrong and using your talent advantages to a degree that allows you to really shut NC State down. This is not a game that NC State should score a bunch of points. If NC State gets over 20, 21 points, Notre Dame's defense didn't do something right. And look, it's just, will they be better in October, November? Absolutely. But this time in the season, game 2, this is not a team that should be able to have some of that success. And if the weather is not good, then that even adds more to the notion of you can't let him run. You can't let him take off with his legs if the weather's bad, because that's when you can kind of get into some throwing over your head situations in bad conditions. So, we'll see how it plays out. But those are the keys for me for Notre Dame being able to keep NC State in check this weekend, which is going to be done by keeping Brennan Armstrong in check. So that's part 2 of today's show. I'm going to do another little quick break here before we come back. I'll be back in about a minute, and we're going to finish the show off by looking at some of the big games from this past weekend. So I'm going to go with a little bit of an intermission here. But before I do, folks, do me a favor, hit that like, hit that subscribe, hit that notification bell, share this podcast. And if you haven't done so already, sign up for the boards at boards.irishbreakdown.com. I promise you're going to love the content that we've got going on there, and some pretty good discussion. And some of the things that are being discussed that I'm not overly fond of, but I'm going to be cleaning that stuff up here very, very soon. It's going to be part of my weekend assignment for some of those type of things. But overall, love the community. I think you will too if you haven't done so. Go ahead and sign up for that. So we'll be back here very shortly to talk about week 2 action in college football. All right, we are back for part 3 of today's midweek rundown, and we're going to talk a little bit about Notre Dame, or week 3 of college football season, or week 2 of the college football season. Notre Dame is obviously going into game 3. I'm going to talk about a few different things. Number one is I'm going to talk about the ACC and the opportunity that is in front of the ACC this weekend. Going to talk a little bit about the Big Ten and some of the things that I'm very curious to see how that conference does this weekend. And then lastly, just talking about the biggest matchup of the weekend, which is obviously the Texas Alabama game. We'll dive into that and what that game means and Won't talk about the SEC as a whole, because honestly, it's a pretty rough slate of SEC football. Georgia plays Ball State, Kentucky plays Eastern Kentucky. The one interesting game that I do like that I won't talk about in the ACC section is the Ole Miss and Tulane game. Very, very curious how that's going to go. Arkansas plays Kent State, Tennessee plays Austin Peay, Missouri plays Middle Tennessee, LSU plays Grambling, Florida plays McNeese State. Two games that I am very curious: SEC versus Pac-12. SEC fans were losing their minds about how the Pac-12 went undefeated last week, 13-0. There's two SEC versus Pac-12 matchups this weekend that I'm very interested in. One is Arizona, Mississippi State, and the other, Mississippi State is a 9-point favorite. And then the other is Auburn heads out west to Berkeley to play Cal. Auburn's a 6.5-point favorite. I would love to see the Pac-12 sweep those two games. Would love it. And so, who else would? The Big 12, because obviously Arizona is going to be in the Big 12 next year. And then again, it's the ACC, because Cal is about to join the ACC. So if they're able to get a win over an SEC team, that would obviously be a bit big for those leagues. But I want to start off by talking about this weekend. I want to talk about the ACC. And one of the things that we discussed last week, and we've discussed this summer, is the opportunity that is in front of the ACC this season. Now, adding Cal, Stanford, and SMU, and the money revenue that they're going to get by not paying Cal and Stanford a full share for, I think, 7 years, and eventually gets up to full like a 9 or 10, but it's going to be limited up until about year 7, and it starts to escalate a little bit. And then SMU's taking no TV revenue for 9 years. This is TV revenue. They'll all still get bowl shares and those other type of shares that they have, NCAA tournament, all that kind of stuff. This is the TV money shares. And that should save the ACC for at least the next few years. It's going to be very hard for Florida State to get out now. It's going to be very hard for Clemson to get out now, as much as they want to get out. It's just going to be, to me, it's going to be too hard for them to be able to do that for at least the next few years. At least that's based on where things are now. So one thing that can help the ACC is to put a better product on the field, which then ups your TV value in a lot of ways, because there are some fickle ACC fan bases. And if these teams can kind of rise up and become much better football programs, all of a sudden their fan bases, whether they're basketball schools or whether they're just fickle fan bases, they start tuning in more. That makes the ACC more valuable. And obviously the NC State Notre Dame game is a big chance for the ACC that none of us want to see them take advantage of. But when you look at last week, for example, you had some big wins. Obviously, Tennessee beat Virginia. Nobody cares. They expected that to happen. But there were two marquee matchups between ACC and SEC teams last week. And the ACC won both convincingly. North Carolina beat South Carolina 31-17 in a game that they really controlled for most of the game. And then, of course, Florida State smacked LSU in the second half of last week's game. There are more opportunities in week 2 for the ACC that they need to take advantage of. There's another ACC versus SEC battle this weekend when Wake Forest takes on Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt's 2-0. They looked better last week than they did in week 1 or week 0 against Hawaii, but they're 2-0. And Wake Forest is 1-0. This is a chance for there was actually some I think Vanderbilt had like 2 or 3 first place votes or something crazy like that in the SEC East, which I just think is really nuts. But this is a chance for the ACC to say, hey, we're 3-0 against the SEC. That would be absolutely huge for them. And then there's another SEC versus ACC matchup this weekend. And that's the one that I'm really intrigued by, that I want to spend a little bit more time on. That's Texas A&M at Miami. Obviously, these two teams played last year. It was one of the ugliest games of the year. Texas A&M won, I think it was 17-14. Neither team really wanted to win that game. Neither team played well enough to win. It just was, when two really bad teams are playing, somebody has to win. It just can't end in a tie. Texas A&M was the better team that day, but it wasn't a pretty better. It's just they weren't as bad as Miami. It was 17-9. 17-14 is the score in which they lost to App State. Texas A&M lost to App State. Texas A&M came out in their first game, looked great against a bad opponent. New Mexico beat them 52-10. Should have beat them that convincingly, but last year's Texas A&M team may not have beat them that convincingly. I thought Connor Wegman played, who, if you followed me over the years, I'm a big Connor Wegman fan. Yards weren't great, but he had 5 touchdowns. Love that kid. Really talented run-throw quarterback. They were able to play better it's more balanced. I felt, trying to run the football. They didn't run the football very effectively, but they tried to run the football in that game, which I thought was good. They're going to have to do a better job of that against Miami, and Miami is one of the biggest unknowns to me cutting into the season, because Miami's a team that doesn't have the talent that they used to have. I mean, like a few years ago when they were talent was being wasted by Manny Diaz, but they're still a lot more talented than they showed last year. They have some very talented freshmen on campus. They had a 38-3 win over Miami in the rain last week. I thought Miami looked good in that game, considering the elements of the game. They weren't dominant. They weren't ripping off big plays, but they ran the football effectively. Their backups came in and ran the football effectively. But more so, I thought they did a good job of really shutting Miami of Ohio down. I mean, Miami had no chance to run the football, and 51 yards on 25 carries. I thought their defense did a really nice job as well defending Gabbert, who only threw for. I mean, they only went as Miami of Ohio went 13 of 24 for 164 yards. It's a really convincing win for Miami, Florida. This is a different animal. Last year it was at Texas A&M. This year it's at Miami. If Wake Forest wins, it would actually make it 3-1, because I forgot about the Tennessee-Virginia game. And then if Miami comes out and wins this game, it really serves twofold. It means two things. Number one, it's a huge win for the ACC. Huge win for the ACC. And would make the ACC 4-1 over the SEC. The thing about that 4-1 is, I'm trying to think, it would give them 2 wins over ranked opponents, and a third win over a bowl team from the SEC. So it's not like Clemson's beating Vandy, or Florida State's beating Kentucky or Missouri or Auburn, or a team that's inferior to them. It's Florida State beat LSU, the team that a lot of people picked to win the West, the defending West champion. North Carolina beat South Carolina, a team that a lot of people think is going to have a chance to finish in the top half of the SEC, a team that went to a bowl game last year, won 8 games last year, ascending program, signing 5-star recruits, all that kind of stuff, and beat them convincingly. And then if Texas A&M can beat Miami, if Miami can beat Texas A&M, that's another ranked a big SEC opponent that you've got a victory over. It likely vaults Miami into the top 25, which gives the ACC another top 25 team. So this is a huge weekend for those teams. And then for Miami specifically, it's not a Miami's back moment, because it's Texas A&M. They went 5-7 last year. And for all the hype about, Texas A&M is going to be better and all that kind of stuff, if you beat Texas A&M, it's like, okay, well, maybe Texas A&M's not back yet, which they're not. And I like the Bobby Petrino hire, but Texas A&M doesn't all of a sudden have a magically better roster than they had. And everybody, yes, Jimbo did a bad job last year, but they had an inflated roster, and from a perception standpoint, they just did. And so this is a chance for Miami to kind of announce that, hey, we're not that team from last year either. The other part is Miami and Texas A&M are very similar programs in that they're getting recruits in a very similar fashion, which is, let's be honest, NIL. And if they can win this game, that gives them a leg up, because they actually go after a surprisingly a similar number of players, right? Like that they're crossing over against. And so I think that helps Miami, and it helps Notre Dame. Let's be honest. It helps Notre Dame. If you're a Notre Dame fan and the ACC keeps winning, and then you keep beating the ACC teams, like let's just say hypothetically, and there's a couple other ACC games, but they're not SEC related. So let's say Pittsburgh beats Cincinnati, right? And you get a Big 12 win. And let's say you go out and Virginia Tech beats Purdue. You got a Big 10 win. And then those two SEC, you have those 2 SEC wins. Okay, that's great. But then Notre Dame goes on the road and smacks NC State. Like that means something. And then in 3 weeks, when Notre Dame heads to Duke, they beat Duke, and then they beat Louisville, and then you dominate the SEC again, or the ACC again. And then you look at the ACC and you're like, yeah, but the ACC did very well outside, other than Notre Dame. The ACC's record was this, and this many wins, this many losses, but man, like 6 of those losses were to Notre Dame. Right. And you beat the SEC 5-6 times, because, Florida State's going to beat Florida. You're going to have some of those wins. Hopefully Louisville can beat Kentucky. Those are end of the season chances for the ACC to have some statement wins. But if you can get that early season start, it changes the perception of the ACC. If Notre Dame continues to dominate the ACC, they've now won 28 straight 28 straight games in the regular season against the ACC. Then all of a sudden that boosts Notre Dame's overall profile. in my view, and that's good for Notre Dame. And that's why I think those games are very, very intriguing for me this weekend to go look at. Now, speaking of perception, let's talk a little bit about the Big Ten. Look. That was one of the ugliest weekends of football I've seen from the Big Ten. It really was. Michigan looked good. Their score was not as convincing as you'd expect. Anyone that watched that game, they called off the Dogs in the third quarter. It was 30 to nothing, 30 to 3, 30 to nothing, and then they yanked a bunch of starters. Harbaugh wasn't there. They could have hung another 2-3 touchdowns at least on East Carolina, who's a decent football team. The Minnesota-Nebraska game was ugly. Michigan State beat Central Michigan 31-7, but it was ugly. Indiana, Ohio State had an ugly win over Indiana. Penn State's win over West Virginia was good. Drew Aller was impressive in the game, but West Virginia stinks. Wisconsin didn't look great against Buffalo. Iowa didn't look great against Utah State. Fresno went on the road and beat Purdue. Illinois needed a last-second field goal to beat Toledo. It was a bad opening weekend for the Big Ten. Well, now you fast forward to week 2, and the Big Ten's got some chances to, maybe look a little bit better. But you're going to need to. It could also end up being a bad weekend for the Big Ten, and so it's going to be interesting. Friday night, for example, Illinois travels to play Kansas. I really don't know what to make of Kansas right now. I mean, obviously, we saw how they played early last year, but then we saw how they played late last year. Jason Bean, they didn't play Jalen Daniels a lot. I don't know if he's injured. I haven't looked into that. He played a little bit, but he didn't play a ton. They played Jason Bean a lot more in that game. I don't think that's – actually, I don't know that they played Jalen Daniels in that game because he didn't have any production. So maybe they didn't play him. But they, beat in Missouri State. That's a game you should win. Illinois struggled Toledo. I'm not surprised by that. I said this last week. Somebody asked me, what's a game that could surprise us? And I said, I don't know if they're going to win, but I really felt Toledo was going to give Illinois a game. And they did. They almost won. If they just couldn't make a couple stops in the fourth quarter, but I did think Illinois' offense looked better. I did. I thought Altmaier looked better than what we saw at quarterback last year. Now their defense has got to clean some stuff up, but I think that's a really good Toledo team. I do. There's no shame in needing a field goal at the end to beat Toledo in the opener. It's like what I said about Navy. It's a survive and advance game if you're Illinois. It truly is. Look, this is a good football team. People aren't going to recognize it because it's Toledo. And, but so the perception's not great. But for me, I think that was a quality win to kick the season off. But now you go to Kansas, and if you drop this one, then now it's like you barely beat a MAC team, and then you just lost to Kansas. If you win, obviously that's a quality win. Some other games in the league, Purdue starts the season off with a home game against Fresno, which they lost. Now they got to travel to Virginia Tech. So this is another one of those ACC opportunities, but it's also an opportunity for the Big Ten, but it could also be a black eye for the Big Ten if you lose another matchup against a Power 5 team. Virginia Tech, I thought, looked good, not great, but good against Old Dominion, especially in the second half. Grant Wells was turnover-free. That's a positive. He's now in year 2 there after coming over from Marshall. They could not run the ball in Old Dominion. That's a problem. That is definitely a problem. But they certainly threw the football a little bit better. I kind of like Purdue in this game. I thought Purdue looked good offensively last week against Fresno. I think Fresno's a really good football team with Jeff Tedford. We'll find out if I'm right about that or not. But this is Purdue needs to go on the road and win this game to save face a little bit and prevent the Ryan Walters era from getting off to a really, really bad start. Because if you lose at home to Fresno and then you play at Virginia Tech, then next week they're home against Syracuse. That's no gimme. And then the rest of their schedule is Wisconsin, Illinois, at Iowa, home against Ohio State, at Nebraska, at Michigan, home against Minnesota. If they don't beat Virginia Tech next week, there's a chance that they could start the season off 1-8 or 1-7. So this is a big weekend for Purdue. They cannot afford to go on the road and lose to Virginia Tech. They have to win that game. But if Virginia Tech wins, that's another statement victory for the ACC. Nebraska plays at Colorado. Here's another one. The way the Nebraska played last week and the way that Colorado played, like the line right now is Colorado -3. I was surprised by that because I'm like, did you watch Nebraska's offense last week? Did you watch Colorado's offense last week? Colorado could score 24 points and win by 14 against Nebraska. Now, The other side of the coin is Minnesota has a excellent defense and Colorado does not. So how does that kind of play into it? But man, Colorado's that is going to be look. I wish actually I could be there. If I wish I still lived in Denver. This is the first time I've ever said this in my life. I wish I still lived in Denver because I would be at that Colorado game this weekend because that crowd is going to be nuts. Now the Colorado fans kind of drive me nuts because they're very bandwagony. But right now they are fully on the Deion Sanders bandwagon, and that win over TCU just solidified all their faith and their blind faith in Deion is no longer blind faith in their eyes because they just went on the road and beat the defending national runners up. Huge win for the program. That crowd is going to be nuts. And this is an old school Big 8 rivalry game. I mean, this is Nebraska, Colorado. For people my age, this used to be a game I used to love late in the year. I mean, this game was played a lot in November back in the day. And this was a lot of times great football games. I mean, just some classic top 10 matchup games when I was a kid. And even when they both weren't great, they were both just good. It was still played in some great games. So this is a rivalry game. And if Colorado wins, again, that's another statement win for the Pac-12 and for the Big 12 because Colorado's going to the Big 12, and another black eye for the Big 10. Iowa at Iowa State. Here's another one. Iowa's defense looked pretty good last week. Their offense looked a little better throwing the football. Running the run game wasn't a whole lot better. I thought Iowa State had a really nice win in the opener. I just don't know what to make of Iowa State. You know, with the quarterback being out, you've got your running back, Jaleel Brock's no longer with the program. I really don't know what to make of Iowa State. I really don't. And although I think that the win over Northern Iowa was a good one, Northern Iowa was traditionally a really good FCS team. Last year they were okay. They were 6-5 last year. They did lose to Air Force. They lost to North Dakota. It was a good program. They lost to South Dakota State, the eventual national champions, by 3. So, I mean, they were a good 6-5 last year. You know, this is a team that traditionally is a pretty quality program. And 2 years ago, they played Iowa State and only lost by 6. So this year, Iowa State beating them a lot more convincingly. It's at Iowa State. This game is usually low scoring. Iowa's got to – if Iowa's the team that I think they're going to be, they're going to come out and be better on offense this week. They're going to move the ball and outscore Iowa State in a low-scoring game, 20-17, 17-14, something like that. Losing, again, this is a chance for the Big 12 to get a statement win. And let's be honest, the Pac-12 isn't reveling in wins by Colorado. The Big 12 is. The Big 12 is praying that Deion Sanders is legit and that Colorado is legit. They're praying because that could give them a marquee program and a big TV market to come into the league next year because Colorado's going to the Big 12 next year. So if Colorado can win, 9-10 games, which is still, I think, going to be tough. The one win was great, but I think we're going to look back at the end of the season and say that win had a lot more to do, that says a lot more about TCU even than it did Colorado. But if Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter and some of those transfers are what they looked like in week 1, then Colorado's could be a 7-8 win team this year. But if they can be even better than that, that's huge for the Big 12 because that's going to give them a preseason top 15 team next year. That's going to get a lot of attention, a lot of hype. Look, Deion's one of those guys. He's kind of like the coaching version of Notre Dame. Hear me out. I'm not comparing his personality or anything like that. Deion's Deion, right? But nobody has, in my opinion, I've literally never met anyone who's indifferent about Deion Sanders that's a football fan. And even people that will try to explain to me that they're indifferent, they do it with such disdain that it's like, no, you're not indifferent. You dislike him and you refuse to acknowledge him because you dislike him. That's not indifferent. That's dislike. You either love Deion or you hate Deion. That's just and it's a part of it is because of his personality, but more so because of what he was as a player. Right? It's like a lot of Notre Dame fans never liked Tommy Rees. Why? Not because he was a bad offensive coordinator or this. It was more because they didn't like him as a player, and they could never evaluate him just as a coach. It was just they didn't like him as a player. Deion's in a similar fashion. But that's good for the Big 12 because love him or hate him, eyes are on him. It's like Notre Dame. Love or hate Notre Dame, you watch Notre Dame because you love Notre Dame or you watch Notre Dame because you want him to lose, but either way, you're watching Notre Dame. And that's good for the Big 12 when Deion goes there. Now, if you can start the season off with a win over TCU and a win over Nebraska, you've already doubled your win total from last year. And all of a sudden, like the storyline about Colorado takes off. For the Big 10, It's another black eye over what's been a really rough start to the season. Wisconsin plays at Washington State. Last year, Washington State beat Wisconsin. That's going to be a very interesting game. Are they going to be able to go out and have some success? I don't know. Like when I watched Wisconsin, and they struggled throwing the football. Tanner Mordecai was last week, at least for that game, what I've always thought he was, a system guy that doesn't play well against better competition. He's in a system where he doesn't quite have the weapons that he needed, that he had at SMU, at least not early. They're still learning that system. It's a little different system than one he ran at SMU. And they had to end up just resorting to running the football. Now, they ran it very well against Buffalo, went for over 300 yards. They're going to have a tougher time doing that against Washington State. Washington State has really developed a quality, not great defense, but a really quality defense. It's going to be a little tougher to just go out there and run all over them. This is another chance for the Pac-12 to have a great win, which just continues to anger me as to why the Pac-12 did what they did. I mean, I get it. It's about money. But, man, this could have been a great year for the Pac-12, and it's already started off that way, and it could continue. But I'm saying right now, the Big Ten could be coming out of week 2 of the college football season with some really ugly losses, and even the wins are ugly. And that's going to be a very interesting part of the week 2 action that I'm paying attention to. Now, the biggest game of the weekend, and one of I'm not, like, I'll be honest, I'm usually not a fan of noon games as an analyst. I like them as a coach because you get up and you get to it. But as an analyst, I'm usually not a big fan of them. This week, however, I'm kind of looking forward to it because Notre Dame will be over by 3:30. And, we'll get some work done. We'll have the post-game show. I'll have the Ole Miss Tulane game on. Texas A&M Miami will be on kind of in the background. I'll watch a little bit of the SMU Oklahoma game at 6 o'clock. But at 7 o'clock, Texas and Alabama. And I'm very much looking forward to this game because I'll be honest with you, folks, I think both of these teams are big question marks. Now, they're not question marks. Are they good? I think they're both good. But do we really know how good either of them are? They both played inferior opponents, pretty much dominated them. Texas was more impressive Alabama was more impressive in their win over Middle Tennessee than Texas was in their win over Rice, but they still handled business. Won by 27. I think it was 37-10. Everybody's talking about Jalen Milroe now. Is he legit, or was it just one good game against a bad team? That's what we don't know. So then you look at Texas, and they did some good things against this past week against Rice offensively. They had some good moments. They called off the Dogs a little bit late, I felt, where maybe they could have punched another touchdown on the board. Quinn Ewers had a solid day, 19 of 30, 260 yards and 3 touchdowns. Running the football was shaky, in my opinion, but we did see the first real action for Jadon Blue, who was a former highly ranked running back. Coming out of high school. So he got some decent action. He got 10 carries in the opener, only had 15 all of last year. So what is Texas? Were they able to shake off some of that game 1 rust, which, a lot of teams do. We saw their weapons. They spread the ball around effectively. Alabama came out, ran the football on Middle Tennessee. Obviously, Jalen Milroe was part of that. But he obviously wasn't alone. He threw the football efficiently. Obviously you weren't out there throwing it for 1 million yards, but he's very efficient. 13 of 18, 194 yards, 3 touchdowns. Tyler Buckner came in, completed 3 passes. Alabama ran the ball for 205 yards. He had Roydell Williams had 36. Jason McClellan had 39. Justice Haynes had 29. Richard Young had 18. You kind of spread that around a little bit. Tyler Buckner had a touchdown run of 9 yards. And of course, obviously Jalen Milroe had 48 yards and 2 touchdowns. So, when I look at this game, it's going to be a sort of you're going to have to declare who you are in this game with that Texas and Alabama. If Alabama is who we think they are, this should be the game you run the football a little bit better. Because like when I look at Alabama's rushing yardage last week, like the numbers look good and they had some big runs, but I wasn't blown away. I thought they would be better running the football than they were last week. And they had 205 yards, but only 5.1 yards a carry last week against Middle Tennessee. I'm like, I don't know how good that is, right? And we'll see what Middle Tennessee State is, but Middle Tennessee had a really good rush defense last year for that level. So you kind of look at it and say, was it kind of like what Notre Dame did to Navy? where that's a better rush defense than you think just because of where they are. I don't know. We'll see. I just wasn't blown away by it. But this week we get a chance to find out if maybe Middle Tennessee's a little better run defense than we think. Texas is obviously going to have size. I think their defense is going to be a little better here in year 3. We're going to find out what they're able to do this week. I thought their rush defense against Rice was spectacular. 27 yards, 25 carries. Rice isn't very good, right? I mean, that's a given, right? I mean, Rice is a team that went 5-8 last year. Played in a bowl game simply because they didn't have enough teams. Lost to USC 66-14 last season. Lost to Southern Miss in the bowl game. Lost to UTSA 41-7. Lost to Western Kentucky 45-10. Lost to Charlotte 56-23. You get my point, right? They're not a very good football team. But Texas did what you're supposed to do. This is sort of that. If Texas wins, we're going to hear the whole Texas is back stuff like nonstop, and it's going to get nauseating, and it's going to drive me a little nuts. And honestly, it's kind of partly why I'm not sure that I am going to be fired up about Bama losing if they lose this game. And I'm always kind of root for Bama to lose because, you want to see that dynasty end so somebody else has a chance to kind of step into it. It's more so because I just dislike the SEC. If I'm going to be completely honest, I don't love the SEC because of the hype and all those type of things. But, I also said I love this Bama roster in a lot of areas. We'll find out this weekend from Bama about who they are. Is Kevin Steele the guy that I think he is, which is not good? Or am I wrong about Kevin Steele? And for whatever reason, him and Nick Saban just mesh well together. He hasn't meshed well at other places as the D coordinator, but running Nick Saban's offense, it goes a lot better. Maybe that's the key. Maybe if he's not who I think he is, then Bama should have some success getting after the quarterback and keeping the Texas offense at least in check enough to win the game in sort of a 27-24, 30-27 type of game. If Kevin Steele is who I think he is, then Texas should score and score a lot. You'll see the pass game. You'll see a lot of blown coverages on the back end, a lot of success throwing the ball down the field. You'll see Sark use motions and alignments and things like that to get some success going in the run game, which then opens up some play action passes. Like I said, I'm just not a big Kevin Steele fan. And I think Texas is capable of winning this game, but they're going to have to play at a very high level because as much as they've improved their roster through recruiting, that's still not as good as Bama's. Now you're going to Alabama, and we're going to find out what kind of demeanor this Bama team has. What's their leadership like? What's their character like? Those are all defining moments of all teams. We're going to learn that about Notre Dame this weekend. What's their character? And they're going to get tested this weekend by Texas. Do they come out flat? Do they come out fired up? Do they come out, executing at a high level? Or are they going to be sloppy in week 2? This is not a team in Texas that you want to be sloppy against because I believe some of the hype against Texas about Texas is like, look, guys, they went 8-5 last year. Like, can we wait for them to beat somebody before we put them in the top 10 preseason, top 10 and top 15? This is a team that lost to Texas Tech and Alabama and Oklahoma State and TCU and lost to Washington in a bowl game. This is not a team that should be in the top 15 based on what they've done. Can we let them win a game first? But then you look at the roster and you're like, yeah, okay, I understand the hype because there's a lot of talent there. And you've already got Jarrell Worthy, and Jatavian Sanders is one of the best tight ends in college football. Jordan Whittington is a very steady, solid player. But you add A.D. Mitchell to that, and all of a sudden you've got 2 legit big-time home run weapons on the outside. Jonte Cook caught 2 passes in his first game. He was a big-time player coming out of high school. You've got some legitimate game-changing weapons now beyond just Xavier Worthy. I keep saying Jarrell Worthy. Xavier Worthy. And that could make Texas dangerous if the line is improved. And number 2, if Quinn Ewers is what I think he's going to be this year, which is he was always overrated coming out of high school. But now, as I've said, I believe he's getting a little bit underrated by some. He's a good quarterback, not a great quarterback, just a good quarterback. And if he can just play like a good quarterback, and then you're going to have some opportunities to make plays if the Kyle Flood's line can hold up. And that's another aspect that's interesting is, obviously Sark and Kyle Flood coached together at Alabama. I believe they were both on the national title team in 2020. So they're going to know what Nick Saban likes to do, and they're going to have better weapons to do something about it. I think it's going to be a fascinating game. part of me would like to root for Texas in this game, but honestly, I have issues with the way that Texas has kind of blown up college football last few years with their decision to try to go to the Pac-12 and then leaving for the SEC and all of that is kind of created, but it was essentially inevitable. This is going to be a great football game in my opinion. I really do. I'd be a little surprised and disappointed if it's a blowout. I would. Could happen. It's early in the season. We don't know, but this is going to be an intriguing matchup. Things to look for in this game. Is Alabama more disciplined defensively with Kevin Steele as the defensive coordinator, or do they continue to have those issues they had in recent years under Pete Golding? Offensively, can they establish line of scrimmage a little better than they did last week running the football, which they're going to need to, because I don't think this is a team that's going to win a national championship or even play in the playoff on the strength of Jalen Milroe's throwing ability. And he can't be a guy that's running around all the time and having to win every game by scrambling and running. You're going to need to support him with a little bit more consistent run game than you had in the opener. For Texas, the big key is going to be early big plays. They're going to have to find ways to create early big plays, which gives them confidence, which quiets the crowd a little bit and allows them to get some early points on the board. The big thing for Texas is to you need to, number one, sustain the early blows from Bama. Bama's going to come out and throw some haymakers. They're going to try to get the ball down the field off some play action. They're going to bring some pressures. They're going to try to force you into mistakes on both sides of the ball. You've got to handle that. Be prepared for the haymakers early. But then you've got to counter punch. That's going to be the big key for Texas. Is and when Bama comes at you, you got to take it, but you got to deliver that blow back. And if you get first chance to strike, to draw blood first, you've got to take it. That's going to be a big part of this game for Texas. If you can get it on top of them, silence that crowd a little bit, that's going to calm things down and allow your football team to have the confidence to say, hey, we can go in this environment and win. This is not something these Texas football players do not know that they can win this type of game because they haven't won this type of game. It's going to be very similar to what I say about Notre Dame when you talk about Ohio State. Yeah, we know they can beat Clemson. We know they can beat USC, but do they really believe they can beat a team like Ohio State? I don't know, because none of them have done it. Right. And this is the same thing for Texas. So we're going to learn a lot about these teams, and it's going to be a very, very interesting game, very fascinating game. And I'm looking forward to watching it. Before we get out of here, I do have 2 super chats that I want to get to, and then we're going to wrap up here. Brian Chesanik says, we'll be at the game this weekend in Irish gear, rooting against the school I go to. Thanks for the hard work, Brian. One less NC State student at the game. Yeah, you DM'd me about this last night, man. I think that's great. I'm going to be looking to see that green jersey in the student section. Mark Krogan says, how does NC State safety being hurt change things? To me, not a lot. They play 3 or 4 safeties. They've got good depth there. It'd be like, to me, it's like Notre Dame losing DJ Brown. Like for me, I mean, they'll have guys of similar ability that they can pop in there. This early in the season, I don't think it hurts. If it was later in the year where maybe they're a little bit more banged up overall as a team, perhaps. But if he doesn't play, I don't think that's going to change things a whole lot for me. It'd be one thing if like Aiden White wasn't playing, or Shaheem Battle wasn't playing, or Peyton Wilson wasn't playing, CJ Clark wasn't playing. That would be a little bit more impactful to me than one of their safeties being down. So anyway, that's going to do it, everybody, for today's show. 6 o'clock tonight, we're going to be back, IB Nation Sports Talk. I'll be back tomorrow at noon. We'll be doing our Keys to Victory game again and our game predictions tomorrow at noon. Ryan and I'll be at a different location tomorrow doing the game. And then, of course, Friday, we'll be back for our Friday mailbag. So we'll be ready to talk a lot of ball. Looking forward to really breaking down the keys to victory tomorrow and then making our predictions. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you all think, because I have a feeling a lot of you are going to predict like really big blowouts. I hope it happens. I just think this NC State team is a little bit better than maybe people think defensively. Offensively, there's still a question mark, but defensively, they're a very, very good football team. And I'm curious to see what we're going to see from Notre Dame, and we're going to break all that down tomorrow. So have a great rest of your day. Make sure you sign up for the message boards at irishbreakdown.com, people. Give us a like, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell. If you're listening via podcast platform, we would greatly appreciate a 5-star review, very, very much. And, of course, you can always stay with us and get our free content at irishbreakdown.com. Thanks for being with us, folks. We'll talk to you again very soon on the Irish Breakdown Podcast.